So if they gave us all superhero subtitles for our speaker bios, I would be the academic. And I've got the elbow patches to prove it. When I was first given the opportunity to do this TED Talk, the organizers asked me if I'd be able to speak a little bit about my research in the field of transgender studies. And at the time, I was sitting in one of Western's cafeterias, exhausted, struggling to finish a section of my thesis. So of course, my first thought was, holy shit, somebody actually wants to hear me talk about this. Best moment of my week. I am a trans scholar. I am transgender, and I'm a hardcore theory nerd, and I just happen to be lucky enough to bring both of those things together in my work. And if I'm being honest, my gender identity and my academic life are of equal levels of importance to me. They both determine who I am. So when I got the chance to talk about some of my research in the field of gender-neutral language in different linguistic systems, well, I could practically hear the internet trolls start to grumble off in the distance. Gotta love YouTube. But I was incredibly excited. There's little I would rather do than talk about my research. It's my passion, it's my life, and every ounce of my energy I put into that because I fundamentally believe that redefining the systems through which we speak about gender will change things for the better, not just for trans people, but for all of us. So I wrote that TED Talk, my big theoretical idea, and I used accessible language, tried to use lots of pretty metaphors, and I practiced it on one of my generous classmates. And they sat there and listened to the whole thing, and at the very end, they said, "So what does transgender mean again?" And, oh yeah, I didn't really get the rest of it. Cool. Imagine walking into a biochemistry lab, throwing open the doors and screaming at the top of your lungs, "Everyone, stop what you're doing, stop the research, I need you to explain what cells are." How do you know that cells are real? Google it? You're the expert. I need you to explain this to me right now before you do anything else. Now imagine this happening again and again and again. There would be no advancement. There would be no biochemistry. People who are trying to think deeply about the subject would not have the time to do that. In short, it would hold knowledge back. But transgender identity isn't really like cells. Cells, they're not politically disruptive. We don't question their existence. In fact, they're kind of fundamental to the way that we look at the world. And yet, we question the existence and legitimacy of transgender identity every day, painting us as deluded or as special snowflakes seeking attention. And so when people ask me, as a theorist, to explain and defend the basic existence of transgender people before I can go any further than that, well, I'm expected to suck it up, smile through it, so that everyone can be on the same page, for the sake of the cause. And what's more, I'm expected to make that story palatable, simple enough to understand, often to the detriment of the wealth of complexity that gender actually is. This takes up most of my time when I'm in the public sphere, and most of my energy, and I didn't want it to take up my TED Talk. There are incredible trans people out there with TED Talks of their own, explaining what transgender identity is, using their own stories. They're on the internet. I encourage you to seek them out. And a big part of me wishes that a preface like this wasn't necessary. But the double standard that's present in how we give some types of knowledge credit over other types of knowledge is incredibly real. And it's a political issue as much as it is an academic one. Statistically, and I'm great at math, so trust me on this, statistically, there's at least one of you internally rolling your eyes and thinking, transgender studies, that only matters to trans people, right? It's a niche discipline. I don't really need to know any of this. It's a pretty common opinion. And it's exactly what I want to challenge today. That is the framework that I want to collide with our general worldview that positions transgender people as exceptions to systems that we already trust. What would happen if transgender identity, just like cells, became fundamental to our way of seeing the world? What kind of knowledge could we build off of the assumption that trans people and perspectives are real and valuable? That's something that transgender studies has the power to do. And today I want to show you how trans studies ask questions about identity that will redefine our philosophies, and how this actually has the power to impact all of our knowledge, from linguistics to science to politics. And through that, I hope I'll be showing you why I hope to spend my time doing things other than defending the existence of cells. So, in the 4th century BCE, the Greek philosopher Aristotle came up with a model of the cosmos. He was one of the best minds of his day, obviously. And so when he did this, people paid attention. And he based his model off of his philosophies, off of astronomical observations, all of the best knowledge that he had access to. And based off of that, he believed that the Earth sat at the center of the solar system, surrounded by these celestial spheres that held all of the stars and all of the other planets. Great theory, super wrong. And it showed in little ways, such as the fact that Aristotle couldn't actually explain how these spheres interacted as physical things when they moved. And it was that one small crack in understanding that happened to be the reason that other people, like Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Galileo, kept thinking about this and kept proposing new models. This became key to the way that we approach knowledge. If there is one thing that your theory cannot account for, it is not because that thing is an outlier and should be treated as an exception to your rule. It is because your theory is not robust enough to explain it alongside that which you have already been able to understand. The cracks in our understandings, those pesky little facts that we can't quite cram back into our version of the truth, have historically been the most productive kinds of evidence. When I was in my first-year German class here at Western, I noticed one of these cracks in my own understanding. I was struggling, as many first-year language learners do, to write an assignment, and I was attempting to talk about my partner. And I realized, to my frustration, that partner is not actually a gender-neutral term in German. In English, I could use it to avoid saying boyfriend or girlfriend, but in German, in order to complete my homework with the acceptable level of grammatical correctness, I would have had to say mein Partner, the masculine, or meine Partnerin, the feminine, making an unavoidable determination about my partner's gender, which they don't happen to make themselves. Turns out, there's very little that you can say about somebody in grammatical gender languages like French and German without referencing their gender, or without putting in a lot of extra effort. And the crack I'd noticed in our dominant perspective was not the fact that other languages exist and work differently, that one's kind of a given, but the fact that there seemed to be less room in some languages for some identities than there was in others. And that must affect the way that those identities are lived. Now, as you probably know, gender-neutral language is something of a catalyst for debate in our society right now, centered around what language can be used, apparent conflicts with free speech, and the ethics of introducing made-up words into a language. While we're here, I'm going to let y'all in on a little secret. Humans made up all of the words. All of them. Anyway, so I started using the assumptions that I was hearing in the conversations around me, and those were that gender neutrality is disruptive to language, which is static, fixed, and reflects the real world, and that it was therefore gender neutrality whose legitimacy was in question. But I soon realized that there was nothing in those conversations, nothing in the debates or the dominant frameworks that actually explained why not having your pronouns used is a painful and visceral experience for trans people. So I started studying whether it's harder to express yourself if you're running up against grammatical gender, and how this actually feels for trans and non-binary people who are trying to use gender-neutral language in those languages. I did a first-hand qualitative study. I had nearly 200 participants, and all the while I was focusing on that one thing that our current frameworks for thinking through gender-neutral language couldn't explain. Interestingly, the ways in which the issue of gender-neutral language was framed by my participants was very different than the way that it was being framed by non-trans people arguing about it in newspaper editorials and comment sections. While still a political issue, to be sure, for the people that I was talking to, this wasn't an issue of containment in language. Rather, it was an issue about the truth and legitimacy of one's identity having no room to exist in other people's frameworks. My participants taught me that for them, language is not just a set of terms through which we speak, but a set of existential parameters through which we collectively determine what is possible and what is not, what is speakable and what is left silent. This started to reveal that the pronoun question wasn't really about pronouns at all, but about a collectively constituted vision of the real that we are all invested in creating. This gave me new insight. And this new outlook, this new iteration of my theoretical perspective on language came from trans people, and it led to a better way, and a more interesting way, of conceptualizing this question. When trans identity became fundamental, when it became the lens, rather than something that was a point of debate in itself, or which had to be proven worthwhile, I was able to dig deeper to the actual philosophical question that was being asked, and see how it connected to something much larger than itself. Now, our generation is not the first to study transgender identity, not by a long shot. The study of gender variance actually began in the late 19th century with a discipline that was called sexology. Now, these were, for the most part, white, male doctors, normal in all respects, who were tasked with studying those who were abnormal. So, there's a skewed power relationship there already. People who today might have used the label transgender were being treated as objects of academic and medical study rather than humanized subjects. And of course, their perspectives, unsurprisingly, were absent. Unfortunately, this formula has stuck around, and it gets reproduced in really insidious ways, such as when people who aren't transgender argue about trans issues without employing the lens of trans experience. And when this happens, as it sometimes does in the pronoun debates, the questions that we end up asking are already distorted. They rely on frameworks that never really had any room for trans people in the first place. But those frameworks have a special sort of power because they're positioned as objective, which is usually code for the fact that they aren't biased by personal opinion. But if we look a little closer, it becomes clear that no knowledge is neutral. It can never be separated from humanity. It can never be separated from the social and historical context in which it's stated, and what we're already taking to be true when we start asking questions. And by pretending that it can be, we're severing an entire branch of valuable insight. The expertise that trans people have of our own experience is being done a disservice by falsely objective frameworks, which are really still biased towards gender normativity in ways that we are so used to, we don't even see them anymore. It's time for trans experience to move from being an object of knowledge to being one of its creators. Every one of us in this room has a different way of being embodied in the world. And philosophically, it's been shown that if there is a part of our bodily schema that differs from the norm, we gain a heightened awareness of it in ways that other people don't have. It becomes a lens in itself. For instance, since I have suffered from kidney stones since I was a small child, I live with the unfortunate and unusual fact that I can feel my kidneys all the time. In a similar way, I can also feel my gender all the time, in every single space that I walk into, and even in objects that I encounter, such as page 19 of our programs, where it lists a men's and a women's washroom, despite the fact that there is a gender-neutral washroom right there. And so, over time, for me, encounters like this have built up to a greater understanding of what it means to be gendered in our world. But that understanding and that knowledge is really hard to fit back into our existing frameworks. And I end up having to shave off the edges to make it fit somewhere where space wasn't made for it in the first place. And it's hard to use your perspective to mobilize new knowledge when you're having to sacrifice a lot of it so that other people can understand it on their terms. With transgender studies, we have the opportunity to flip the script. What if our aim was no longer to explain transgender identity to the rest of the world, but instead to find a new understanding of the world by using that unique awareness? In other words, why are we still trying so hard to fit ourselves back into the frameworks that we've been given when we have a chance to reiterate the framework itself? What if we literally didn't have to spend the time addressing questions of our own worthiness, and could instead spend that time asking the deeper philosophical questions that need to be asked and which can only proceed from our perspectives? For decades, established academic knowledge has been used to read our stories, our bodies, and our truths back to us in distorted ways. Now we have the chance to use our stories, our bodies, and our truths to read the world differently. And by reading differently, from the perspective of people who know deeply the personal significance of subjectivity and identity and embodiment and gender, we have the chance to uncover truths that have been buried beneath incomplete frameworks for centuries. See, Aristotle's theory was great for its time, just as our models of understanding identity and our place in the world are great now. We don't have to throw everything out. But we never would have reached the moon if we'd stopped and been satisfied with having one thing that couldn't be done justice by our attempts to explain the world. I want to leave you with the reality that this is not always easy. It is not a simple thing to overanalyze all of your internal complexities and give back what you find as a gift to the world. And it is especially hard in academia, where such knowledge is put in inaccurate context with so-called and prized objectivity. Admitting to the complexity of something like gender identity makes us feel useless. We already have frameworks for understanding gender, for understanding binary manhood and womanhood. So when trans perspectives start to pick these apart, start to lift up concepts like authentic and real, and see what really lurks beneath, well, we often end up feeling stupid, or lost, or just plain uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. It's easier to go back to the basics, to stop at the stories, to brush trans experience back into old understandings, to explain the cell again, rather than breaking ground with stem cell research. But we've come to a point where we need to decide what we want out of our knowledge. Whether we're happy with the frameworks we have, and everything they might miss, or whether we're willing to try reiterating a new framework and seeing what we might be able to capture. Then maybe we can stop turning to truths like science to tear trans people down and start using a variant understanding to identify the ways in which science is actually being held back by our cultural assumptions. To be scared of this, I think, is natural. I know I sometimes am. But we must keep moving through that fear to show those who would erase us how introspection can redefine a world for the better. Transgender studies has the radical potential to do things differently now, which is to say, to give us pause about how we create our frameworks, how we arrive at knowledge, and how we uncover truth. And doing this starts, as it should, with transgender people claiming our place within the academy and within the world.